Okay, hello, this is Heather Boyd from Nurture Squared, and I'm here today with an interview with Matt Bodnar. Matt is someone I've actually been following through his podcast, but he has quite a list of accolades and accomplishments that I'm looking forward to focusing on today. He was named for one of Forbes 30 Under 30. He's a restaurateur and an investor, but the main reason that I've asked Matt to join us today is because he founded and runs a podcast called The Science of Success, which has led to more book purchases for me in the past year than I was ever expecting. But the podcast is focused on basically the science of success, what the evidence says around not just success in business and how many figures you're pulling in, but for me, the crux of the issue, what is personal success through mindset, through your vision, and through really just maximizing your potential. So Matt, thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to have you on.
Yeah, well, Heather, thank you so much for having me on the show. And, you know, it's funny, you kind of touched on this, but I think in many ways, and this is something retroactive when we started the show almost 4 years ago at this point, but looking back, the word success in the title, I think sometimes does the show a disservice because it's really not about material success, fame, wealth, money, business, any of that stuff at all. In fact, we repeatedly, almost daily, turn down interview requests for people who have kind of entrepreneurial success stories and things like that, because what we really try to focus on is much more, as you said, kind of that personal side, right? And you know, I mean, I'm a businessman, I'm an investor. You know, I invest in, own, and operate a lot of different companies and businesses. But the science of success is more of getting that personal journey, right? How do we, it's everything from how do we sleep better? How do we communicate with people? How do we deal with our emotions? How do we stay focused and productive on anything? You know, how do we carve out time for what's most important to us? And so, it's been a really interesting journey, and I'm sure we can dig into a lot of pieces of it, but you made a really good point, which is that it's not just about, success as, you know, extremely narrowly defined. It's really about doing what you want in life and achieving and living the life you want to live.
Mm-hmm. Well, and going beyond that, a lot of what you touch on too is broad enough, especially with the aspects of this personal journey and with the assumption that our personal journeys, when they're at their best, are to make the world a better place. So I did a little digging before we started the interview, Matt, and I found I found an older science of success podcast that you did on meditation.
Yeah, that was one of the originals.
Aha, yes, I figured it was. It was going back a few years now, but also a TED Talk that you did on farming initiatives for sustainable farming, both of which I think will resonate with some of the members in Nurture Squared in terms of these personal values being things that nurture the world, that make ourselves better, but also the people around us better.
Yeah, that's totally right. And it's funny because this is a recurrent sort of challenge in my own life, which is, as you mentioned, I have a podcast about the sort of the science behind success and achievement. I'm an investor in a lot of different stuff. I gave a TED Talk around these kind of really cool indoor sustainable agricultural initiatives that we're pioneering in the company we've invested in, sort of the food world. And so it's hard to sometimes coalesce that into a coherent thread or theme or message. But at the end of the day, I think the underlying current is really all about just trying to understand how the world works and trying to understand how individuals work, how I work, how other people behave. And, you know, one of the interesting threads that really unites everything that I do, even things like farming that may not seem like that. And it's funny, I was talking to someone recently who's actually the head of the National Wildlife Federation. And he was speaking at a thing, and I had a chance to talk to him, and he was talking about how wildlife management, the biggest thing people don't realize, it's all about people, right? And that's the same thing. It doesn't matter what field you're in, agriculture, doesn't matter podcasting, everything at the end of the day involves humans. And so the reason that the science of success really sprang about is because of studying psychology, human interaction, human behavior, not only psychology of ourselves, which is tremendously important, but also the psychology of other individuals. Why do they do certain things? How do you influence them? How do you interact with them? And so the kind of thread that underpins everything that I do at the end of the day, and every human interaction period in any field, even things like agriculture, wildlife management, whatever, is psychology. And so that's where, and one of my kind of intellectual heroes named Charlie Munger, who's a billionaire investor, business partner of Warren Buffett, really keyed me onto this idea, which is that if you want to understand anything, psychology is a great starting point because it really underpins everything.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a lot of the people watching this are going to have either a psychology background or certainly are science-based, evidence-based practitioners who really value that evidence base instead of flying by the seat of our pants, so to speak.
That's right.
And I was excited when I was listening to your talk or your podcast on meditation, because you were mentioning scientists like Neil deGrasse Tyson, Carl Sagan, and you even we're talking about Tony Robbins and, as far as the self-help motivation genre. But I wonder if we could back up a little bit and talk about, in terms of your entrepreneurial journey, which, is multifactorial because you are in a lot of different areas. But if we focus more on the science of success end of things, what role you feel that failure can have for an entrepreneur in terms of moving towards their vision?
Yeah, I think failure is essential. I think it's instrumental in achieving any kinds of success. And whether it's the podcast, which has had a huge up and down swing and roads and lots of different failures, including at one point, probably 6 months into the journey of the show, we were just hitting traction. We just kind of hit #1 new and noteworthy. We were getting a ton of downloads. And I co-founded the show with a business partner of mine who ended up really with his company that had sort of distribution. It was a science-based news website called Red Orbit. It still may be around, but we haven't been affiliated with them for 3 years, basically. But we launched a show on Red Orbit. He was kind of my distribution channel. We had this agreement, and within a couple months of the show really taking off, out of the blue, he sold his company, basically abandoned the show, walked away, and left me with no editor, no distribution, no anything, and I had to figure it all out from scratch. And the same week that happened, we got banned from iTunes for some marketing tactic that I read about on a blog that turned out to be against the iTunes terms of service. I had no idea. And so all of this kind of collapsed at one thing, but it's made the show stronger ultimately. And I mean, if you zoom out even beyond the science of success, my entire career is littered with failures. One of my favorite, one of the themes really that I spent probably the last year or two studying is creativity, but in a broader perspective. So reading all kinds of different books about creativity, whether it's Originals by Adam Grant, Where Good Ideas Come From by Stephen Johnson, even things like Mastery by Robert Greene, really trying to understand people who are at the top of their field, who are incredible at whatever they were, whether it's science, whether it's music, whether it's art, whether it's anything, and trying to understand how do creative geniuses, where do they come from? What makes somebody a creative genius? And one of the most fascinating core pieces of research about creativity, and I'll circle this back into failure in a second, is this gentleman named Dean Simonton, who's written several books, and one of them's called Greatness, Who Makes History and Why, and I forget the name of his other kind of seminal work on this, but he did a tremendous amount of research on what he called eminence. And eminence is essentially what we would call today, somebody who's a creative genius, a Beethoven, a Mozart, an Einstein, and he looked across all these different fields, whether it's science, music, math, all sorts of different accomplishments in different genres. And he found two really, really interesting conclusions. The first was that the single greatest predictor of eminence, i.e., somebody who's a world famous scientist, for example, is output. There's a direct correlation between output and eminence. And the people who we've heard of, the Mozarts, the Beethovens of the world, have hundreds, if not thousands of compositions, and a handful of those are famous and well known. The second point, which is even more interesting, is that even eminent creators, even people who we would consider today the Charles Darwins of the world, the creative geniuses or scientists, people had breakthroughs that truly changed the way we live and work or transformed lives, they have zero ability to predict whether their next piece of output is going to be a masterpiece or going to fail. And so that comes back to this idea of failure, because it's so important. Even the people who are at the absolute top of their field, they're not sitting there crafting, and then this is a theme that Simonton goes really deep on, but they're not sitting there crafting one masterpiece and then putting it out and it's perfect. That's not how it works. And that's if there are a few exceptions to that, but the vast majority of these people who we've heard of who are eminent creators all just created a huge amount of output. Somebody like a Thomas Edison, thousands and thousands of patents and ideas, and a few of them were revolutionary, but tons and tons and tons of them were absolute failures. And so the only real thing you can do if you want to be successful in any field is to learn and harness those lessons of Simonton, which is basically to fail, 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 and eventually a few things are going to work out. But even the people who are the best at their field have no ability to predict whether the next thing they do is going to be a masterpiece or going to be an abject failure.
That's fascinating. And it fits into it's something that I was listening to on one of your podcasts about the number of hours needed to master something. I think it was upwards of 10,000 hours in general is what science has figured out is kind of the tipping point for becoming of mastering your area.
Yeah, and 10,000 hours is kind of it's much debated, and I don't know if exactly 10,000 hours is the rule or not. There's a ton of kind of controversy around that number, but suffice to say, the concept of deliberate practice, which is sort of what underpins a lot of that research, is a very powerful phenomenon. And the more you practice in the right ways, the more you move toward the journey of mastery.
Well, and to apply that to parenting, I'm sure we all feel like in some ways we should be experts by now because of the hours that we've put into parenting. But I guess that feeds back into the idea of repeated failure and getting up and trying again and just moving towards where we're really trying to aim towards.
Yeah, and another key piece of that too, that whole idea of deliberate practice is one of the core components of it, and this is so hard in the world to actually get this in things like business, life, parenting, etc., is that rapid and immediate and valid feedback is one of the core components of deliberate practice. So if you think about mastering a skill, whether it's music or chess or poker or something like that, you have really immediate feedback about whether or not you actually made the right decision. And so you can make a decision and then get evaluated on the quality of that. But something like business or investing or parenting, you might make a decision and there's a very murky connection between that decision and that output. And it could be years before you ever know. And poker, which I'm a huge poker player, played in the World Series of Poker for the last several years. And it's a great thinking tool. We actually interviewed on the show some professional poker players who have shared some amazing insights into how to make decisions under conditions of uncertainty. But poker is a great tool for teaching you how to think, because poker innately has a disconnect between decision and outcome. And you can make the right decision and yet still have a bad outcome. And that doesn't mean you made the wrong decision. You might have made a bet that was 80% to win, and yet the 20% where you don't win is what happened. But that doesn't mean that you made the wrong decision. Like, you should have still done that, even though it didn't work out. And so it's such a complex rabbit hole that we can go down. But the more you can kind of cultivate or discover ways to get feedback about whatever you're doing, even in these sort of murky realms where there's a big disconnect, the better. And that's something I think about a lot, is how in the realm of business can I apply the framework or deliberate practice to improve my ability to evaluate investments or be a better marketer or any of these kind of skill sets.
Well, I think that picks up on, and I meant to make a list of the podcasts in particular that I had listened to, the specific ones of yours, but one of them was talking about literally how to elicit the right kind of feedback from the people that you're interacting with so that you get useful information.
Yeah, that's right. We have a half dozen episodes that have gone into that. One of my favorite tidbits, and I forget exactly which interview it is, but I can email it to you later, and we can throw it in the show notes if you want. But it was that the most interesting thing about feedback is that it's not new information to anyone who's giving you feedback. And yet we somehow live with our heads buried in the sand and basically think, if I don't ask and they're not going to tell me, they're already thinking it. That's why they tell you if you ask them. They're thinking that, hey, you didn't do very well on that sales call, or hey, you're really disorganized, or whatever. They already think that about you. You just don't know it yet. So burying your head in the sand and pretending that you're not going to ask doesn't actually change the fact that everyone else already thinks that. It's just you who's in the dark. So there's really no actual barrier other than just ego and fear of rejection and sort of fear of embarrassment to getting feedback in social context, especially, other than just getting out of your own way, which is, honestly the barrier to most things.
Well, I think that idea of fear and the fear of embarrassment or the fear of failure is something that really does get in the way, especially for those of us who are putting a lot on the line as we balance parenting and trying to get a good business going. You can sit with me, sweetie. I'm so sorry. One of the things I did want to ask you about was surprises in entrepreneurship for you. Or have there been pleasant surprises that were not expected as you started the podcast or as you ventured into entrepreneurism, that were kind of hidden gems that were just kind of a surprise for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it comes back to the same framework that I shared earlier from Dean Simonton, right? As I said, I've had a dozen failed projects, failed blogs, failed, YouTube channels, failed all kinds of different things. And the podcast happened to be successful. We had no idea. It was an experiment. We recorded, I think it was either 4 or 6 episodes and launched them and had no idea what to expect. And it got enough traction that we doubled down and kept doubling down, kept doing it. But that was a total surprise. And the weird thing about it, there's this whole story that I can go into if you want me to kind of go all the way back. But there's about 5 steps in this process of even just launching the podcast that I didn't have any sort of initiative in driving any of them. I was pulled by the universe basically to this step, to this step, to this step that ultimately led to the podcast. I didn't know anything about podcasting, audio, engineering, editing, any of that stuff. I was convinced by someone else to even attempt starting a podcast. And that's kind of how we ended up on this journey. But there was many serendipitous surprises that kind of resulted in that.
Serendipity is, I love that word and I love that concept because it, just even in terms of where we are with Nurture Squared right now, I think it was one person suggested how handy it would be for a group of women who are parents and entrepreneurs to get together. And honestly, I don't know why I said yes in the first place, but it's been fun ever since. Even if we're small but mighty. And it's, it's certainly serendipity kind of allows things to fall in place in ways that are not predictable.
Very true.
What I also wanted to ask you about this idea of masterminds and their usefulness in terms of tapping into a broader group of people with expertise who are at different points in their journey, but are collaborating together to support each other and help each other out.
Yeah, I mean, I think masterminds are an incredibly useful tool, incredibly useful framework. And if you look, you may not hear about it a lot, but if you look at many, many, many successful people have some form fashion of a mastermind that they've implemented or executed in their lives. I've been a part of a number of different mastermind groups over there's a term that's kind of generic and vague, and there's lots of things that sort of fit within the spectrum of what a mastermind is. But I think broadly, any activity where you're surrounding yourself with peers or people who have sort of a diverse range of experiences and backgrounds that can all contribute to your business success, give you feedback, give you guidance, all this kind of stuff, along with a level of confidentiality and vulnerability where you can share explicit information, whether it's about your personal life, whether it's about your business struggles, etc., is a really powerful framework. And there's a bunch of science and reasons behind it. But broadly speaking, the sort of social proof phenomenon of surrounding yourself, the power of proximity of surrounding yourself with people who are going to push you to achieve more. There's the accountability component of sharing or committing to something in front of a group of peers, and then the added sort of incentive that gives you on a subconscious level to actually achieve that. There's the simple ability to just get candid ideas and get outside of your own mind, because as we said earlier, so many people just get in their own ways. And if you can, sometimes you're so close to a problem or situation or whatever that it's really hard for you to step outside of it and see this obvious thing that you need to do, right? And sometimes having something, a framework where you can really share a problem candidly, and then have someone go, you need to do this, and then you go, yeah, I know, I'm like too afraid or scared or whatever. And I haven't been thinking about that, but you're right. Like that's the obvious decision. Right. And so those are some of the useful tools that come out of things like mastermind groups.
Kind of like being lost in the woods and having someone far enough away to see the path out. They can see the direction. Yeah. Great. I also wonder, when I was, I've been listening to a lot of your podcasts, and of course, as I said earlier, it's led to a lot of book purchases that have been really exciting.
That's good.
Point, not only for helping Nurture Squared, but just helping my private practice in occupational therapy as well. One of the themes that you have been returning to in your intro to most of your podcasts lately is this idea that all the information in the world is not going to help you unless you're able to A, remember the key pieces, and B, be able to apply it. Wonder if you could
totally true
a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that that's a huge component of what I call my sort of learning architecture, which I'll come back to and explain in a second. But I think you brought up a really important point, which is this idea that the barrier, and this honestly comes back to the notion of self-sabotage and getting in your own way in many ways, but the barrier to most things is not typically intellectual. It's typically emotional, right? And the reality is oftentimes what's stopping you from doing the thing you need to do or getting you to the place you want to get to is some kind of emotional hang up. It's not an actual intellectual hang up. It's not a lack of how-to information. It's often some sort of psychological barrier, right? Which comes back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of the conversation, which is that psychology underpins all of this stuff. But coming back to the idea of how do we, as I think I put it, organize and remember everything, right? And that's something that I'm obsessed about. And you can kind of see some of my bookshelves back there. There's more over there. My whole room is basically surrounded by books, and I'm a voracious reader. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this and trying to answer this problem. And I basically created an architecture where I try to spend, and honestly, I would like to spend more, and sometimes I do spend more, but I try to spend at least 1 hour a day on my learning architecture, which is basically broken out a couple times a week. That's just simply sitting down and reading, or maybe it's watching some kind of video instruction or some, consuming new information in some way. But I prefer to have it be richer, kind of more long form information as opposed to TV or pop news or whatever, which I actually sort of strange, but I don't consume any news of any kind. But I try to have an hour a day basically carved out for deep learning. And I set this 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. I try to do my learning architecture, right? And so about 3 of those days are for actual consuming and learning of new information. One of those days is for creating some kind of review content. And so if I read something, I'll typically create what I call a book note for it, or book notes. And it's maybe a 1 to 5 page summary of the book, the theme, the key themes and ideas from that book. And then often it's accompanied with a mind map, which is a whole nother can of worms. And we have a couple interviews where we dig into memory and memory strategies and stuff, but it's basically a visual representation of the key themes of the book on 1 page, which is a really cool way to basically look at that and remember it really easily. And then the last day is, and typically Fridays, is 1 day of review. So what I'll do is I'll pull out and review old book notes, old mind maps, old things like that, on a cadence following roughly what's called a forgetting curve, which is, if you look at the science of memory, the idea is essentially that if you study something, let's say you study it day 0. If you review it, 3 hours later, it helps boost your memory. And then you review it 1 day later. And then you review it 3 days later. And then you review it a week later. And then you review it 2 weeks later. And then you review it a month later. And then you review it 3 months later. And so this cadence starts out with the very short review periods. But as you internalize it, the longer you expand out the review periods, and they start to get to every 6 months, every 3 months, every 6 months, every year, whatever, it bakes this idea into your memory and you don't forget it. And so there's a free open source piece of software called Anki, A-N-K-I, that I use to just keep track of things that I want to remember on a forgetting curve. And that kind of tells me or helps me figure out, all right, this week, what are the 3 or 4 book notes that I should review this week? And so the idea is basically, if you're going to read something or consume any kinds of content, and I use Evernote as the backbone to basically manage all of this. But you could use Google Docs, you can use anything. I just find Evernote to be a really useful tool for organizing information. But the idea is basically, if you're going to read something, reading it and then throwing it out is kind of useless, because if you don't implement or execute anything from that book, it's no different than if you never read it, right? Or even if you can't read. And so how do we capture all those lessons? Then how do we create action steps and apply them? And that's something that I try to do in the podcast too. Every single episode, we try to end with some kind of action step that's a concrete first step somebody who's excited about the content of that particular episode can start to implement for themselves.
Fantastic. Well, it reminds me that, I guess that it's been handy for me to keep listening to your podcast, because one of the first ones that I listened to was James Clear on Atomic Habits. And I did make notes on his book, and they are in a folder of mine that I open, not intentionally, but periodically. And the points around developing good habits have certainly been more salient and more applicable because of that accidental rereading. So I'm sure it would be even more effective if it were deliberate. I wonder too whether, and I know we're getting close to the end of our time, but, and I know this might be an unfair question to ask you, to try to pick one of your favorite interviews, because as those that have been following me on Facebook know, I frequently post the podcast of yours that I'm listening to. But
I appreciate that.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's really been a useful way to spend my time listening and absorbing information. And again, it's got me on a bit more of a reading kick than last year too. If you maybe not your favorite, maybe that's an unfair word, but is there anyone that rises up to the top in your thinking or in your actions these days that you'd want to recommend people start out with on your podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously, I mean, we've done over 150 interviews, been doing this for almost 4 years. And so we have a lot of shows in the catalog. I would say we have created what's called a best of. So listeners or people who want to find kind of our favorites, and these are a combination of fan favorites and some of my favorites. And you can find them at successpodcast.com/best of. So that's kind of one resource, but I would say recently an episode in particular that was really impactful for me, and I think one of the better episodes we've had in the last couple months, was an interview with a gentleman named Josh Kaufman, who I think that came out last week. He is the author of The Personal MBA, which is one of my all-time favorite books. And he has a new book that recently came out called How to Fight a Hydra, which is how to take action in the face of uncertainty. And it's kind of a narrative parable. But that conversation was really, really insightful and really fascinating. And we went deep into a toolkit or a set of thinking tools that I think is probably the most powerful way to think about the world, that we really explained in depth and kind of analyzed it and talked about how you can concretely start down the journey of applying that mental framework to understanding and thinking and taking action in your life.
Fantastic. Okay, I haven't listened to that one yet, so now that'll be my next one. We are drawing to a close, and I want to finish by saying that I think one of the biggest lessons that I've learned from doing Nurture Squared is that when I reach out to people that I'm either enjoying their books or enjoying listening to their podcasts, or I see what they're doing and I like it, that reaching out is certainly a great place to start. And sending you an email a few months ago merely to tell you that I was enjoying your podcast is what has inevitably led to this interview. So I want to thank you for being open to responding to that email and also being open to being interviewed today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Heather, thank you so much for having me on the show. And it's funny. I mean, that's one of the hidden benefits of being a podcaster, right? Is that you can start to form relationships and connect with all of these really interesting people, and you get to learn from them and talk with them and start to build all of these relationships. But I have the same experience. I mean, now I've kind of learned that, right? I've learned that same lesson that you learned, which is when I see somebody who's interesting, whether it's reading an article, it's a book, whatever, I'll sometimes just ping them and just be like, hey, love this article about X. I'd love to chat with you at some point and just hear more about what you're working on. And do they respond every time? Certainly not. But do they respond with enough frequency that I end up having some really interesting conversations, building some great relationships with people? Some of them come on the podcast as guests. Absolutely. And so that's, life at the end of the day is success in any field is kind of like a pipeline, right? You have to talk to a lot of different people and realize that even if 95% of people say no, 5% of people are going to say yes. And if you talk to enough people, if you talk to 1,000 people, that's 50 people who are going to say yes. That's a massive number. It can have a big impact on your life.
Well, and those that do respond are interested in either sharing their expertise or their experience. So they're the ones that you want to talk to anyway.
That's right. Exactly.
Well, thanks again, Matt. I appreciate your time.
Well, Heather, thank you so much for having me on.
It's a pleasure. Bye for now.